Okay, welcome to Lifespan Development. In our first lecture, we're going to go over general principles about lifespan development. We're going to go over what development is and different ways to conceptualize aging. And then we'll go over some of the major theories about lifespan development. And by the end of that, we should be good. So let me share my screen, and I'm going to start the slideshow. So I wanted to start at the beginning. So long story short, when we talk about lifespan, and forgive me for my older slides, but the principles are the same. But when we talk about lifespan development, each of these words needs further clarification. So when we look at the word lifespan, what is the lifespan? When does life begin? So there are different philosophical debates about when life begins, but from our point of view, life begins from conception. And when does life end? Life ends at death. So we are going to look at developmental experiences from womb to tomb. So when we talk about lifespan development, we're looking from womb to tomb. Next class or next lecture, I will make some differences between the legal arguments about when life begins. For those people who are pro-life versus pro-choice, I'll make some distinctions and we'll see where we land. But for this class, all we need to know is the lifespan is from womb to tomb. And development, well, what is development? Development refers to changes that occur. And these changes could occur across many different domains. They could be physical changes. They could be cognitive changes. They could be socio-emotional changes and so forth. So changes that occur across the lifespan. Now, many of you would have said development is growth, and you would have used the term growth rather than using the term changes. But as we will see, our physical prime is in early adulthood, and then we start to have some regression. So it can't just be growth or positive development. It has to be any change, whether it be positive or negative, that occurs across the lifespan. And that's actually why we look at conception, because there are changes that are happening prenatally. All right, so let's begin. So as I said, development is a pattern of movement or change that begins at conception and it goes through the lifespan. Now, it can include positive growth, or it could include regression or decline. So we'll see in middle adulthood that we start to have physical and physiological changes that are not positive. There's decline in hearing, there's decline in vision, there's delayed reaction time. And even on cognitive things like memory, we start to see some decline in various forms of memory and intelligence. So we do see development goes up, but then it starts to go down again. So there will be decline as part of development as well. Now, when we talk about developmental psychology, there are two ways to look at it. There's the traditional approach, and then there's the lifespan approach. The traditional approach focuses from prenatal development up to adolescence. And the reason why most people who take the traditional approach do that is because many of the major theories that explain developmental psychology stop somewhere in adolescence. And you're going to see that in this class as well. However, there's little emphasis on what happens in adulthood and the decline in old age, because from a traditional point of view, the massive changes that occur start to slow down, so it's not prioritized. Whereas in this particular class, we're going to focus on the lifespan, and we're going to focus on changes from womb to tomb. And because developmental psychology or lifespan development tends to be one of those courses that are valuable if you're a psychology major, if you are an education major, if you are a nursing major, and so many others, it's very important that we take a lifespan perspective so you get what you need out of this class as you move forward with your degree. So we're going to take a lifespan approach. Now, when we talk about lifespan, the oldest documented lifespan is roughly 120 years old. Most people don't live that long. So yeah, you'll notice that things have shifted. But a better number is what we call life expectancy. Now, life expectancy is the average number of years a person can expect to live unless something shortens their life. And that's about 78 to 80 years old. So that is the average life expectancy. Now, people live older than that, and you're going to read from the baby boomer generation that there's going to be a rise in centenarians, right? Those people living to 100. But the average lifespan is about 78. The peak of lifespan is a little over 120 years. All right. And on your right, there's also an interesting graphic because we are living longer. If we go to prehistoric times or ancient Greece or even 100 years ago, we are living longer than our ancestors. And there are many reasons why this is occurring, right? Because we have better healthcare, we have better nutrition, we are not living in the elements as much as we used to. We're more careful about disease and water and things like that. So we're living longer. And that is a good thing in many ways, but we're also going to see in late adulthood that there are some problems with us living this long, mainly neurocognitive disorders like Alzheimer's disease, Huntington's disease. Dementia is a serious problem. And the older you get, the prevalence of dementia increases with age. So some scientists argue that we are outliving our brain. And that's what's responsible for some of the neurocognitive decline. But in any event, that's where we are with life expectancy. And since 2005, very little has changed. So when we look at lifespan development, you could look at it from many different viewpoints. You could look at it as a lifelong perspective, a multidimensional perspective, a multidirectional perspective, a plastic perspective, multidisciplinary perspective, and contextual. And we're going to cover all of them. Don't worry about the fact that I'm reading off a list and not explaining it, because as we move through the slides, I'm going to cover each of these. But in general, it's very important to understand that development includes both our growth, maintenance, and regulation of loss. And it includes biological, sociological, sociocultural, and internal individual factors working together. So when we say development is lifelong, early adulthood is not the end of development. And that's important because if you look at many of the child development textbooks, they stop at adolescence. And then what happens in adulthood? Well, early adulthood is not the endpoint. Changes continue to occur in early adulthood, middle adulthood, later adulthood, and so forth. And there's no real age period that's better than the next. No real age period dominates. So there's these phrases of being over the hill. Well, but there are also other phrases that say your golden years, and they're contradictory messages. But in general, we say that each age period has a function and something to learn. And the theory that's most relevant, as we'll talk about going forward, is Erickson's theory. Things are happening across the lifespan. All right, so it's lifelong. It's multidimensional. When we experience the world around us, we're experiencing the socio-emotional factors, but we're also experiencing our internal cognitive factors, our mental processes, and biology. And each of these dimensions are overlapping. So the physical domain includes your biology, things like physical growth, genetics, hormones, things like that. Cognitive development refers to the way we think. So memory, intelligence, judgment, decision-making, planning, these kind of things would be put into the cognitive domain. And then socio-emotional things are related to social factors, the environment we live in, and emotional factors, how we regulate our emotions and so forth. And there, as I listed several things, you could see there are multiple components within all three of these dimensions. So I like to treat them as almost like a Venn diagram that has three circles that are overlapping. They're not independent, they're actually interdependent, and your physical development could impact your cognitive development, and your cognitive development could impact your socio-emotional development, and vice versa. All of them could impact one another. Development is multi-directional. So we talked about expansion and shrinkage, growth and regression. So some aspects, some dimensions or components of a dimension are going to expand. Others are going to shrink. So one example of both expansion and shrinkage in the brain, if you look at the brain's development, it is amazing. You start by single cell that splits and splits and splits and turns into this massive structure, this 2.5 pound brain that we have. But it takes time to develop into that 2.5 pound brain. And there are all these neurons that are connecting, and it's growing, and the brain gets larger up to a certain point, right? To a certain volume. And then it plateaus and it stays at that volume. So we've had increase in neuronal tissue. However, we talked about Alzheimer's disease. We see atrophy. We see shrinkage of the brain. And there are certain areas of the brain that do different things. So the hippocampus is responsible for memory functioning. And sure enough, when we talk about Alzheimer's disease, there is shrinkage in volumetry studies of the hippocampal area. So we have both expansion and shrinkage, and it can occur in both ways, both directions. Plasticity, we talk about neuroplasticity. This is the ability to change, or the flexibility to change. When we talk about the brain in particular, the brain is most flexible for change in earlier points in time. In fact, your brain is most plastic or flexible to adjust to trauma from birth to about 6. And then from 6 to about 11, it becomes moderately plastic. And then 11 plus, it is largely hardwired with few exceptions. So there, the ability for the person to change or adapt also changes across the lifespan. And development, when we talk about development or changes that occur across the lifespan, we don't have a monopoly on this science. You'll see that development is of interest to psychologists, hence a psychology class, but sociologists, anthropologists, neuroscientists, medical researchers, right? So educators, so many disciplines have an interest in development because it affects the whole organism. So because it affects physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional domains, those three domains, it's going to be of interest to all kinds of disciplines. So we draw from all of these disciplines, and we don't believe that psychology is the sole or superior voice on this topic. Development is contextual, right? So when we talk about changes that occur, it's important to understand the setting the person is in. So things like history plays a role, finances play a role, the society as a whole plays a role, and the culture you live in plays a role. Each of these factors are going to make your experience unique. So I'll give you an example. Two people. One lives in the United States. One lives in Japan. They're two very different cultural experiences. Is the worldview going to be the same or similar for these two groups? Probably not, based on the value system. All right, so let's not be so extreme and do East versus West. Let's say United States versus United States. People born in the 1920s versus people born in 2000. Is the worldview going to be the same at different historical time periods? The answer is no. Finances. Two people living in the United States in 2020. One is very wealthy. One is economically disadvantaged. Is their experience going to be the same or similar? And so forth. It goes on and on and on. The point is that when we understand the development of a person, we have to understand the context, the unique factors. So we do have three influences that we look at. So we look at normative age-graded influences. So we look for people of a given age group, what they're supposed to master. So when we talk about IQ tests, many IQ tests are age-based. So we look at what you were supposed to know at a given age or be able to perform at a given age and what you actually can perform, and we compare the two. And because we compare the two, well, if you're better off than what your chronological age is, then maybe you're more intelligent than your age mates. If it's lower, then we give you a lower IQ score, but whatnot. So we compare you relative to your peers and what you're supposed to know or perform at a given age. Normative history graded influence. So again, it's very important to understand that people of a particular generation see the world differently because of historical circumstances. I always say that we lived in a different world pre-9/11 relative to post-9/11. And I'm not trying to be overly political with this, but just think about travel. Think about travel before 9/11. Some of you are like, well, I wasn't born. I was really young. I don't remember travel. Just watch movies. So there's a holiday classic called Home Alone. And if you look at Home Alone and the McAllisters, they run all the way up with their tickets to the airplane virtually. Post 9/11, you have to go through TSA. You have to go through screening. That would never happen. So the world has shifted. in 2020 with the COVID pandemic, the way we take for granted our health and interacting with others has shifted. So there's more of an emphasis on hand sanitizer or wearing masks, which in other parts of the world, they have been doing this for years. But because of a pandemic in 2020, the whole world is operating similar to East Asia. It shifted. It shifted in a massive way. So history matters. Same thing I said, if you were born in the 20s versus now, 1920s versus 2020s, it would be different a century later. And then non-normative life events. So we talked about normative history where everyone experienced the same thing, but it's also very important to understand the unique experience of the individual. And there are people who are experiencing trials and tribulations that you can't even imagine all over the world, including New York and New Jersey, and in our safe country that we call home. But, you know, think about people who have food insecurity or housing insecurity. Some people will never know those struggles. But I bet some of you know someone, or maybe you experience this, and it's going to affect your personal development. Let's move on. So we talked about development includes growth, maintenance, and regulation of loss. That's fairly a review. And we talked about the internal factors, the individual characteristics, and the social cultural factors. So let's talk about some important contemporary concerns. So we talk about health and well-being. Health and well-being is incredibly important. And if the pandemic didn't teach you that, I don't know what will. Our health is so critical. Now, before the pandemic, our health and well-being was also important to us. And you could have seen it then. I would have used a different example before the pandemic, but I would have talked about you go to your local Barnes and Noble or magazine store and count the number of health and fitness magazines there are, or well-being. This could be physical well-being or psychological well-being. Go to the self-help section of Barnes and Noble, and you will see that there's a lot of resources writing and trying to explain health and well-being. This is very important. And each member of society, no matter where you are around the world, you want to be healthy. You want to have both physical and psychological well-being. And the struggles we face as we will go through these lectures, you will see, are different across the globe, but nevertheless, everyone is striving for the same thing, health and well-being. We also talk about parenting and education and the value of education. Parenting styles differ within and across cultures. So it's very important to talk about effective parenting. And I'm not just going to take a Western point of view. I'm going to give you some research both on Western parenting and what the ideal parenting style is. And then I'm also going to give you some research on more traditional cultures and the effect of authoritarian parenting and whether or not that is as harmful as we believe it is. But we also want to pay attention to sociocultural factors, context, diversity. Other than COVID-19, the other major shift in 2020 was the spotlight on structural oppression and racism. So there are different Americas. Two people walking down the street don't experience the same America. So we want to understand things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. because that's going to be important to fully appreciating the experience of those who come through your doors, whether it be in your classroom, whether it be in the hospital setting, or whether they come into your treatment room. So culture, what is culture? These are behavioral patterns, beliefs, and all other products of a particular group of people that are disseminated from generation to generation or passed down. Our ethnicity includes many different things. So cultural heritage, nationality, race, religion, and language all impact the definition of one's ethnicity. Our socioeconomic status, our financial position, our educational attainment, and the prestige people put upon us. And gender, the experience of males, females, gender fluid, and trans community are all unique from one another. And our experiences are different, and many of us profit from different forms of privilege based on being male. I'm not naive that I experience male privilege. And for what does that look like? Well, that looks like many things, but I'll give you one. When I walk down the street, I'm not objectified for my body, and it's more common among females, and so forth. So understanding the unique struggles of each group is going to be important. So we also, as I said, we have to understand the various domains, the biological component or the physical component all has to do with brain, body, genetics, hormones, and so forth. Your cognitive development, these are thoughts, intelligence, language, and so forth. And socio-emotional factors are your emotions and your experience with others, your relationships, friendships, personality, and so forth. So now let's talk about developmental periods. This is one of, this is one of two slides that are going to be very, very important, because as we go through the lessons, you're going to see that your developmental period is used as a framework for each of the lessons to follow. So what are developmental periods? Those are just a fancy way of saying time frames. So we have the prenatal period, and that's from conception to birth. And prenatal development, as we're going to see, is going to be further divided. It's going to be chopped up into smaller pieces, and birth is going to be chopped up into smaller pieces. But for now, prenatal development is one time period, roughly 9 to 10 months. Infancy is birth to about 18 to 24 months. Some textbooks will say 12 months. But in infancy, you see that the organism is highly dependent on adults. For the first year of your life, you're pre-verbal. And your only way of communicating is through crying. But just because you're nonverbal, or pre-verbal is a better way, I like to say it that way, doesn't mean that you're not developing. There are a lot of things that happen physically, psychologically, and socio-emotionally during infancy. And then we have our early childhood, which is the end of infancy to about 5 or 6. People refer to this as your preschool years, where you start to see self-sufficiency and increased play. Then you have middle and late childhood, which is 6 to 11 years. This is your school age years. This is when you first enter the school. Now you have to focus on self-regulation, self-control, and academic achievement. Then we have adolescence. That's from puberty till early adulthood. Now, there's a massive physical change that happens. You have 2 growth spurts across the lifespan, in infancy and in adolescence. So you have all kinds of changes. The changing body questions your sense of self, your sense of identity, and you strive to become autonomous or independent. Early adulthood, this is when you are now in the workforce and you're now finding a romantic partner. So this is your late teens to early 30s. And I'm going to divide it differently later in the semester because I think it's important to understand different ways to conceptualize these. But the biggest thing, biggest two goals are finding a romantic partner and getting a job and settling down. Middle adulthood, now we're starting to interact with society and our social responsibility. And now we're looking for legacy, passing things down to the next generation. And then late adulthood, we start to do a life review and we start to, I guess, come to terms with our mortality, because in late adulthood, now we're facing the prospect of death because there are more years behind us than are in front of us. So those are the developmental periods. I have a lot more to say about it, so I'm not going to go point by point, but that's important to understand. Now, there is another way to break these periods down, or the 4 ages of development. The first age is childhood and adolescence. So those we're looking at when you're a dependent. That's the best way to say it. It's when you're a dependent from the sense of the society. So your second age is prime adulthood. This is between your 20s and your 50s. And your third period is 60 to 79. And then fourth period is 80 and older. So if I were to ask you, well, when do you think is the happiest time for you? Is it your first age or your second age? Many of you probably would say somewhere in your first or second age, but we've done research on this and it turns out that no age group reports on average more happiness than another, more satisfaction than another. Each age group has its own stress advantages and disadvantages. And this is a great study by Diener, D-E-I-N-E-R, who demonstrated that the percentage of people who are happy, whether you be 15 to 24 or whether you be 65 plus or anywhere in between, is roughly 80%. 4 out of 5 people report being happy. And it almost looks like a straight line because the differences are negligible across the lifespan. So when you're saying, oh, I'll be happier when my kids are out of the house, or I'll be happier when I get a job. No, you won't. You will be happier if you choose to be happy. Each of us can choose to be happy people. And we don't have to wait for some monumental event to happen for us to be happy. If you're looking for that, then you're probably going to miss all the opportunities that are right in front of you, waiting for this happiness to emerge. Now, when we talk about age and aging, how should age be conceptualized? Well, the conception of age shifts in many different ways. So chronological age is what you're most familiar with. What does your birth certificate say? How old are you? But there are other ways to view age and aging. So your biological age, so your physical health. There are people who are 40 but are physically starting to decline. So if a person has early onset Alzheimer's, and it seems to be the theme of today's lesson, but if a person has early onset Alzheimer's, then maybe they are older than what their birth certificate says. Or your psychological age. Your psychological age is your ability to adapt to the roles of society based on your chronological age. And then your social age is how well you fit in with the societal roles and expectations of society. Those are different things. Now let's talk about nature versus nurture. This was a historic debate as early as Socrates and Aristotle. And that debate that started in ancient Greece remains to this very day. So, nature versus nurture. When we say nature is who you are based on biological inheritance? Or nurture, is it due to environmental experiences? And if you were to ask Socrates, he would be on the position of nature. And if you were to ask Aristotle, he would be on the position of nurture. If you were to ask Rene Descartes in the time period of the Renaissance, he would take the position of nature again. If you were to ask John Locke, he would take the position of nurture. But if you were to fast forward to later philosophers like Immanuel Kant, he would say it's a combination of the two. You need both a priori, biological, and a posteriori, nurture, environmental factors. So really, this debate that has occurred and people have taken one side or the other, it's kind of silly. And today we've seen that the position, it's really not nature versus nurture, it's nature via nurture. So both factors play a role in making you who you are. So nature are the evolutionary or genetic factors that promote commonality. Nurture are the environmental factors, biological factors that promote individual differences. Stability versus change is a second debate within our literature. Who you are, do you stay the same or do you change across the lifespan? And just like nature versus nurture, where we try and pick a side, I'm going to tell you anytime you say a versus, it's probably a combination of the two. Dichotomies are traps. So some things are going to be relatively stable and other aspects of who you are going to change. So stability, on the side of stability, things like your personality traits, they're relatively stable. Your overarching personality is relatively stable, but certain unique aspects of personality can be shifted. For example, if you were to do a full assessment of personality on me, you would discover that in general, I am an introvert. But I am not shy. I believe myself to be engaging. I interact with students very well, but I'm an introvert. Every personality test I've taken has suggested I'm an introvert. But what I found fascinating in the years of teaching is that my personality has shifted. It has shifted a little bit on this introversion, extroversion domain towards the middle. Now, what can account for this shift? I don't think I'll ever turn into an extrovert, but why am I moving towards the middle? The answer is simple. Part of my job requires me to give presentations, requires me to go to conferences and be social, even when it's sometimes painful. As an instructor, if I were to be shy and reserved and guarded, I will not connect with you. So if I'm trying to connect with you, I think it's important for me to engage you. And all of these years of teaching has helped me become a more engaging person. So I've shifted a little bit on one small aspect of personality. So some things can change based on experience. Many things stay the same and vice versa. So some things stay the same, some things change, and that's a combination of the two. Is development smooth and gradual, or is it burst-like? Well, by now, this is the third question I've asked you, so you know that it's a combination of the two. So when we talk about continuous processes, that is suggesting that we have a smooth, gradual process that is continuous, similar to a small tree. As it gets older, it becomes a bigger tree with a more massive arbor branches, but a tree is a tree is a tree. Right? It's smooth and gradual. It just gets taller and bigger. whereas other things are discontinuous, stage-like. And when we talk about discontinuous development, it's important to understand stages. And in stages, there are a burst of development. It's no longer gradual. And another important part of these stages is that it's transformative. Your perspective on the world shifts as you move from one stage to the next. You're no longer seeing the world the same. And remember how when I talked about continuous development, I described a tree as a tree as a tree. Not everything in nature works that way. Because if you think of a caterpillar goes through many stages of its life. It starts as a caterpillar, it eats, it eats, it eats. Then it wraps itself up in a chrysalis, a cocoon. And then when it leaves the cocoon, it's no longer the same. It's transformed into a butterfly. So it started as a creepy crawler worm-like structure, and now it's a flying entity, transformative. So when we talk about stages of development, it's important to understand that. So what's the point? I want you to know these because these are going to resurface these debates, nature versus nurture, stability versus change, continuity versus discontinuity. I'm going to remind you of what we said today. But I wanted to have the building blocks here in our first lesson. The other lesson is don't take extremes, because most things are a combination of factors that come together. And most developmentalists acknowledge that development is not all or nothing. It's not one or the other. It's usually a combination. All right, so now let's talk about theories. Theories are frameworks of understanding the world around you. Developmental theories or lifespan developmental theories are trying to understand development. And there are different theories, and I'm going to go through each of these theories. Now, it's important to understand that not everything that is said in these theories are actually true. And you might ask yourself, well, why do we teach these theories if some of the pieces of information in these theories have been disproven by science? The answer is that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Each of these theories has something to offer. They're not perfect. They add some value. They give you some perspective on development, but not the full picture. So I'm going to cover some of them. Let's start with psychoanalytic theories. So when we talk about psychoanalytic theories, you probably have heard the major player in this domain, Sigmund Freud. You don't need my class to hear about Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud focused on the unconscious. In fact, Sigmund Freud believed that the unconscious is the most influential aspect of personality. And he talks about the mind as being the iceberg, and most of the mind is hidden. So he went on different paths to try and understand what is in the unconscious. And he tried different things like hypnosis to tap into the unconscious, dream analysis to tap into the unconscious, and psychotherapy to tap into the unconscious. And he looked for your experience, and sometimes there are taboos that we push beneath the surface, and they manifest in symbolic ways. So your true understanding of a person requires you to understand the symbols or symbolic meanings of their behavior. That's one thing that was important from psychoanalytic lens. In addition, Freud believed that early childhood plays a role in later development. So Freud puts a strong emphasis on the parent-child relationship, and if there is a problem in development, it's likely due to some parenting factor that caused a fixation, which we will talk about as we go forward. Now, Freud's theory or stage theory of development is the psychosexual stage theory of development. And he says you go through 5 stages: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. These 5 stages, you have unique challenges. So the oral stage, pleasure surrounds the mouth. And when we think of the oral stage, this is in infancy, birth to about 18 months. What is the biggest thing that we know that kids are trying to master at that point? Feeding. So whether you're bottle feeding or breastfeeding doesn't matter. There is the feeding is the greatest source of pleasure in infancy. And you have a dilemma. When do you take the child off the nipple, whether it be physical or metaphorical? And if you take the child off the nipple too early, or you allow the child to nurse too long, the child could develop an oral fixation. Remember what I said, early child development affects you later at a point. So fixation is when you get stuck and you have an unresolved issue from a stage of development, and that affects your later point. And Freud said there were oral fixations like biting your nails, that was an oral fixation. Chewing on straws and pens is an oral fixation. Being overly sarcastic is an oral fixation because it's related to the mouth. Eating disorders is an oral fixation. Substance use disorders are an oral fixation. So you might say, well, why substance use disorders? Well, the answer is that we have gotten creative on how to get high in the last 200-300 years. But for millennia, people have eaten leaves or ingested things. So substance use disorders are linked to oral stage of development. But at about 18 months, something else starts to emerge, the anal stage, and then pleasure surrounds the anus, and you have a major gulf between 18 months to 3 years. And anyone who has kids in this class knows that that issue is potty training. And you have a decision when to start potty training. If you start potty training too early, or you delay potty training, you could develop an anal fixation. You could be anal retentive or anal expulsive. Anal retentive is a person whose characteristics are very rigid, or a psychological condition might be OCD, needing things to be a certain way. That comes from the child, according to Freud, not wanting to potty train and holding their bowels in, versus anal expulsive is letting it all hang out. So this could be anyone who's exceedingly messy. So at the age of 3, something interesting happens. We recognize our gender expression. And according to Freud, and forgive the binary nature of this, this is a theory that is not culturally sensitive, but I'm teaching it nonetheless. Males recognize they're males, females recognize that they're females. And according to Freud, males and females have different reactions to this. Males are happy to be male because it comes with power and privilege. And females develop penis envy. They have a sense of inferiority because they don't have a penis, according to Freud. Right? So there is a sense of jealousy of men, according to Freud. There is a sense of wishing you were a man, which isn't really true. But nevertheless, he said this. And for males, you recognize the power of your genitalia, and then you develop a sense of castration anxiety and anxiety around losing the organ. And that occurs particularly because of something called the Oedipus complex, where you're lusting after your mother, afraid of your father, and you're afraid that your father is stronger than you. And if you act on these Oedipal impulses, you're going to be castrated, right? So these are all parts of his theory, and we're going to unpack it in greater detail in a later lesson, but I'm just giving you a flavor. Latency is about 5 to 6. At 5 to 6, you go into school, and then all of your sexual urges are dormant, they're latent. And this is the calm between the storms a play on words, right? So the storm of the phallic stage versus the genital stage. But when you hit puberty, you start to go back to these urges. And then you are capable, according to Freud, in the genital stage of mature sexual relationships. That's at puberty. And he didn't encourage 12 and 13-year-olds to be engaging in sex. All he suggested with the word mature is that the parts work, and if you interact, you have the capability of reproducing. Now, Freud put a lot of emphasis in his psychosexual stage theory on sex. He devalued culture to a great degree, which is a shame. Even his dream analysis, Freud, was overly sexual. So many people who came after him tried to desexualize the stages, right? And they put more of an emphasis on culture over sexual instincts. So we should talk about Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson is known as an ego psychologist. He comes out of the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic tree, but he focused more on psychosocial development versus psychosexual development. He focused more on the ego versus Freud focusing on the id. So he focuses on what you're supposed to master at a given age and how it's resolved. So there are a list of 8 stages from infancy to late adulthood. And we're going to go through these in great detail. So I'm not going to spend much time in this lecture on it because we do a deep dive on all of these theories. But this is a list starting at the bottom in infancy, trust versus mistrust, all the way to late adulthood when we talk about integrity versus despair. Spoiler alert, if you go back to earlier slides, some of the components are already embedded in the lesson. Now, so let's evaluate the psychoanalytic theories. What's the biggest benefit? Well, it puts an emphasis on family relationships, development, and the unconscious. But there's a lot of criticism on psychoanalytic theories about the lack of scientific support and too much emphasis on sex and a more pathological view or negative view of people versus focus on people being healthy and productive. Piaget is our common cognitive stage theorist. He focuses on cognitive development or thoughts. And he has 4 stage theories, right? So the sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational stage theory. And each of these have different changes or mastery that you need to develop. So in a sensory motor stage, you're trying to develop object permanence. In a pre-operational stage, you're trying to develop basic rules of logic and seriation and multiple categories. And then in the concrete operational stage theory, you're trying to develop abstract thought or abstract logic, analytical abilities, which will bring you to your formal operations. So the way we see the world, the way we think about the world shifts based on where we are. And again, here's another one of those graphics that I'm not going to do a deep dive in because we're going to cover it later in the semester. And sorry for the typo, that should say cognitive theories. And those are your 4 stages. Now, Vygotsky is a sociocultural cognitive theory. And Vygotsky is sort of like the other side of the Piaget coin. And we're going to see the position of Piaget. Vygotsky says the opposite. So according to Piaget, cognitive changes are independent, whereas Vygotsky, cognitive changes occur through support of others. Even language development is different. How we change, whether it's through guidance or assistance versus some cognitive conflict. Each of these are individual, are different. But Vygotsky focuses on social and cognitive factors and how you're shaped. And how do you develop? It's simple. More knowledgeable members of society help you develop. whether they be your parents, whether they be your teachers, whether they be your older siblings, whether it be clergy, and so forth. Each people are guided in their development. Other theories from cognitive perspective is treat you like a computer. So an information processing theory views things largely like a computer, that we manipulate information, monitor, and develop strategies. We have memory. When we talk about memory, memory uses the principles of information processing to a great degree. Now let's look at cognitive theories. What are the benefits? So instead of looking at pathology, which Freud focused on, cognitive theories tend to be more positive in nature. They tend to look at the active construction of understanding, whereas according to Freud, you are largely influenced by your parents. Now, many people criticize Piaget about his stage theory and the pureness of his stage theory and the lack of attention on individual variations or variability. But no theory is perfect. That's why I'm talking about strengths and weaknesses of each. So when we talk about behavior or sociocognitive theorists, we have classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and sociocognitive theories or observational learning theories. So behaviorism, by definition, they want to focus on directly observable and measurable factors, right? So Skinner, in operant conditioning, he suggests that a behavior is governed by its consequences. So if you give a person a reward, you're likely going to increase the behavior. If you give a person a punishment, you're likely going to decrease the behavior. It's that simple. Now, Bandura talked about observational learning. And what does Bandura do? He includes behavior, the environment, and cognition all play together. And whereas Skinner believed that you need to learn from your consequences, a behavior is governed by its consequences, Bandura did not agree. He felt that we could learn from the consequences of others. We could learn from models in society. And you might have heard the term role model. So we could observe our parents and we emulate our parents. And if they receive a negative consequence for something, we learn maybe I shouldn't do that as well. So it's okay to learn from other people's experience. So from a behavior or sociocognitive theory, benefit is we focus on scientific research and environmental factors. A criticism of Skinner is he didn't focus as much on cognition, and there's inadequate attention given to developmental changes. So it's almost like an input-output, a stimulus response like a computer. You press a key and then a letter shows up on your Word document. Now, ethology talks about the role of biology and evolution on development. The biggest key from an ethological perspective is the concept of critical periods and sensitive periods. Now, it's very important to understand when we talk about the non-human animal model, we talk about critical periods. And what is a critical period? It's a window of time that development must occur. And if it doesn't happen within that critical period, it will not occur. Now, with human beings, it's not all or nothing. So we talk about with human beings a sensitive period. It's a window of time of maximal development, that development should occur. And if it doesn't occur within that window, it will be incredibly stunted. Now, let me explain some research that demonstrates both of these points. Konrad Lorenz did research on geese and imprinting. And one of the unique things about goslings is that when they hatch, the first thing that they see, they imprint to be their mother. And they will follow them around and whatnot. So what Konrad Lorenz did to demonstrate imprinting was he let these goslings hatch, and he was the first thing that they saw. And sure enough, these goslings followed him. They followed behind him on land. When he swam in the lake, they swam behind him on land, in the lake. You know what I mean, right? So whether it be on land or sea, they followed him because Conrad Lorenz, according to these geese, was their mother. He also demonstrated if they hatch in isolation, where they don't see another goose or him, eventually they won't imprint any caregiver or parent. With human beings and human attachment definitely occurs in early childhood, especially the first year of life, it starts to occur. But you could build multiple attachments across the lifespan. Now, I'd like to talk to you about a sensitive period and language development. How many of you have heard the story of Jeannie? Now, Jeannie was a kid that was locked in the basement. Parents didn't talk to her, fed with a food tray, and ultimately had no interaction with others and no language at 12. Psychologists started to work with her, try and build language, and they worked with her for 4 years, and she mastered some language. She got to about the age of a 2-year-old or 3-year-old in language development, but they worked for 4 years, and she never fully mastered language because she didn't learn language in that window of time where she was supposed to, which is birth through 6. So that's interesting, right? She got something, but not everything. She used 1, 2, 3 word sentences, and that's it. That was her utterances. So when we talk about the non-human animal, it's all or nothing. When we talk about the human model, it's that if it happens outside the window, it's going to be severely stunted. So the ethological perspective benefits is focused on biology and evolutionary basis of development. It occurs within natural settings, so a naturalistic observation, but there's too much focus on biology. And I talked to you about the critical and sensitive periods and how it's not absolute all or nothing with human beings, so it might be too rigid, that theory. Now, the last theory I'm going to talk to you about today is Uri Brenner's ecological systems model. And this is a strong focus on the environment. So we talked about biology, we talked about personality, we talked about behavior and cognition. Now we're going to talk about the environment. Uri Brenner says there are many aspects of the world around us that affect our development. We have the micro system. Micro think small scale. That refers to the setting by which the individual lives. Now, that might be your home life. That might be your school. You have direct interaction with these different settings. A mesosystem is the relationship between multiple microsystems, but there's still direct contact, right, between the two. Then we have an exo system, which exo think exit or outer, right? Now you don't have direct contact. So it links the social setting with the individual, but it doesn't have an active role in the individual's immediate context. Now that may seem like a bunch of words, but what I'm going to tell you is that the exo system can indirectly affect your development. For example, when you are 5 years old, do you have direct contact with your parent or caregiver's workplace? Most people don't. Most people never go to their parents' workplace. But your parents' workplace can have an impact on you. How so? If your parent gets laid off, even though you never met the boss, that's going to affect the money in the house, and that's going to affect your development. Your food scarcity, your rent or mortgage could be jeopardized, and so forth. Then we have the macro system, which is the larger cultural value system of society. And I used the example of US versus Japan. One is a westernized nation, one is a more collectivistic nation. One's very individualistic, one is more family oriented in general. And then the last system is a Chrono System, and we talked about time and development. Where you are in time, when you are born affects your development. And the historical events that happen in your lifetime affect your development. So Chrono, think Chronos from the movies, the comics, or Chronicles, the Book of Chronicles, which were the times of various kings. So it's your time periods by which you live in can affect you. And this is the model of the various systems. So the individual microsystem is your family, your school, your peers. And you notice how your family, your school, and your peers could all interact with one another in the mesosystem. But the exosystem is much broader outside of you that could affect you. And then the macrosystem are the larger culture of society. And then time we talked about. So here is a summary of each of the theories. And I strongly encourage you to read them, right? We talked about 5 different theories and where they stand on continuous development versus discontinuous development, what happens in early versus later experiences are important. Read that left column. And on the right side, we talk about nature versus nurture, biological factors versus the environment. And these 5 theories take different perspectives. Now, if you think I went fast, that's okay. I strongly encourage you to reread the slides. I strongly encourage you to replay the lectures. And if you still think I went fast, take a deep breath, because all of these theories are going to resurface in each of the lectures. So you're going to see Freud again. You're going to see Erickson again. You're going to see Piaget again. You're going to see Skinner again, and Lorenz again, and Brenfron, Brenner. You're going to see all these people again. So even if you didn't get it today entirely, it's going to resurface. I want to thank you for indulging me. And next lesson is going to be on prenatal development. Let's stop there.